She disappeared after the wedding night. Years later, the billionaire CEO found her with his twins. The wedding suite still glowed with candlelight when Brandon Ellis discovered his bride had disappeared. Rose petals covered the bed like scattered promises, champagne glasses stood untouched on the nightstand, and her wedding ring sat on the pillow where her head should have been resting. The diamond caught the light, throwing tiny rainbows across the wall, a cruel reminder of vows spoken just hours before. She said forever, but forever lasted one night. Brandon stood frozen in the doorway at 3:47 a.m., still wearing his wedding shirt, the bow tie hanging loose around his neck like a noose. His phone trembled in his hand as he dialed her number for the 17th time. Each ring echoed through the empty room until her voicemail picked up. "Hi, it's Eden. Leave me some love." Her voice sounded foreign now, like listening to a ghost who didn't know she was dead yet. Before we discover what happened to her, thank you, our Mr. Steele Rich Stories family. We've crossed 600 subscribers because of you. Keep sharing, commenting, and helping this channel grow. You're the heartbeat behind these stories. Now, let's step back to where forever began. The Fairmont Hotel's security footage would later show Eden Ellis, née Parker, walking through the lobby at 2:15 a.m. She wore jeans and a grey hoodie, clothes Brandon had never seen before. Clothes she must have hidden somewhere during their reception. She carried nothing but a small backpack and moved with purpose, not like someone fleeing, but like someone who had rehearsed this exit 1,000 times in her mind. The doorman held the door for her. She didn't look back. By sunrise, Brandon had called everyone. Her mother hadn't heard from her. Her sister claimed complete ignorance. Her best friend's phone went straight to voicemail. The bridesmaids formed a group chat within minutes, firing off theories and reassurances that felt hollow even through text. Someone suggested checking hospitals. Another mentioned calling the police. Brandon's best man drove over with coffee and sat with him in silence as morning. Light filled the honeymoon suite that had become a crime scene without a crime. The Newport Police Department wouldn't file a missing person report for 48 hours. "Adults have the right to leave," Officer Rodriguez explained, her voice professional but not unkind. "There's no sign of struggle, no indication of foul play. Sometimes people just change their minds." Brandon wanted to scream that people don't just change their minds about marriage 8 hours after saying, "I do." People don't plan elaborate weddings with 200 guests, smile through 4 hours of photos, dance to their first song as husband and wife, then vanish into the Rhode Island night like smoke. The local news picked up the story by Tuesday. "Newport bride missing after dream wedding" scrolled across the bottom of the screen, while reporters stood outside the Fairmont explaining how Eden Parker Ellis had seemingly evaporated after what guests described as the perfect ceremony. Wedding photographer James Reeves released a statement saying the couple had appeared blissfully happy during the shoot. The florist mentioned Eden had been particular about the arrangements, choosing white roses because they symbolized new beginnings. Everyone had a detail to add, a moment to dissect, but nobody had an answer. Brandon's phone became a battlefield of notifications. Friends checking in, reporters requesting statements, strangers on social media spinning theories. Someone claimed they'd seen Eden at a gas station in Connecticut. Another swore she'd boarded a Greyhound bus to Boston. The tips poured in but led nowhere. Each false lead felt like losing her again, like watching their life together dissolve one pixel at a time on his phone screen. Her wedding dress still hung in the suite's closet. Brandon couldn't bring himself to touch it. The fabric held the shape of her body like a beautiful ghost, beaded bodice catching light whenever he opened the door. Housekeeping offered to pack it away, but he refused. Everything in that room had become evidence of a love that might have been a lie. The marriage certificate sat on the desk, her signature bold and confident. Had her hand shaken when she signed it? Had she already known she would run? Her cousin Rachel finally broke on day 3. She seemed nervous, Rachel admitted over the phone, her voice cracking. "During the reception, I saw her talking to your father in the corner by the champagne fountain. When she came back to the table, she looked pale. I asked if she was okay, and she said she just needed air. God, I should have followed her. I should have really listened. Brandon's blood went cold. What did my father say to her? I don't know, Rachel said. But Brandon, she was crying. Your father handed her some papers, and when she read them, she started crying. The investigator Brandon hired found the clothes Eden wore that night, purchased, with cash from a Target 2 towns over, bought 3 weeks before the wedding. The backpack came from an army surplus store paid for the same way. She'd been planning this escape for at least a month, maybe longer. While they were finalizing seating charts and choosing wine pairings, while he was writing vows that promised forever, she was building her exit strategy. But why? What had his father said? What had those papers contained? Brandon confronted Richard Ellis on day 5, storming into his father's study without knocking. What did you say to Eden at the reception? His father looked up from the financial reports spread across his mahogany desk, his expression carefully neutral. I have no idea what you're talking about. Rachel saw you, Brandon pressed. She saw you give Eden papers. She saw Eden crying. What did you do? Richard Ellis removed his reading glasses with deliberate slowness. I gave your wife, your temporary wife, a copy of the prenuptial agreement. The one you were too sentimental to present yourself. The one protecting our family assets from gold diggers who marry up and cash out. We didn't have a prenup, Brandon said, his voice dangerously quiet. I refused to ask her to sign one. You refused, his father agreed. So I handled it myself. Had the documents prepared, included them in the marriage license paperwork. Simple administrative oversight that she signed without reading. Perfectly legal. The room tilted. You forged my signature. I protected our legacy, Richard corrected. That girl was using you, Brandon. Small-town nobody with paint under her fingernails, suddenly marrying into money. Please. The prenup ensured that when she inevitably showed her true colors, she'd leave with nothing. Brandon stared at the man who'd raised him, seeing a stranger. What were the terms? 5 years of marriage before she could claim any assets. Fidelity clauses, non-disclosure agreements about family business, standard protective measures. Richard smiled coldly. I may have also mentioned that any attempt to contest the agreement would result in legal action that would bankrupt her and her entire family. Her mother's mortgage, her sister's student loans, all vulnerable to collection if she tried to steal what wasn't hers. She wasn't trying to steal anything, Brandon whispered. She loved me. Then why did she run? His father challenged. Brandon had no answer. He walked out of that study and didn't speak to his father for 6 months. The police found Eden's car at Logan Airport's long-term parking on day 7. The ticket showed she'd parked it at 5:43 a.m., roughly 3 hours after leaving the hotel. Security cameras caught her walking toward Terminal C, but she never appeared. At any ticket counter, never showed up on any flight manifest. It was like she'd walked into the airport and stepped off the edge of the world. Her abandoned phone was found in a trash can near the terminal entrance. When the police cracked the passcode, they found it wiped clean except for one note in the drafts folder. I'm sorry. This isn't who I am. Please don't look for me. I can't be what they need me to be. You deserve someone who fits your world. I never will. Brandon read those words until they burned into his retinas, searching for meaning between the letters. She hadn't written, I don't love you. She'd written, I can't be what they need me to be. Not him. Them. His family. His father. To find out why she ran, we must visit the life she once tried to build. Eden Parker grew up in Millfield, Ohio, where dreams were considered luxuries most families couldn't afford. Her childhood home sat on Maple Street, a 2-bedroom ranch with peeling yellow paint, and a front porch that sagged like it carried the weight of too many broken promises. Inside those walls, her mother Linda worked miracles with government cheese and generic cereal, turning food stamps into feasts and hand-me-downs into fashionable outfits through sheer force of optimism. Beauty isn't about what you have, Linda would tell Eden while hemming a Goodwill dress on their kitchen table. It's about seeing possibilities where others see problems. The sewing machine would hum as Linda transformed a stranger's discarded formal into Eden's 8th grade dance dress, adding ribbons from the dollar store that caught light like real silk. These lessons shaped Eden more than any classroom ever would. Eden's notebooks came from the thrift store, their pages already half filled with someone else's abandoned algebra. She'd carefully tear out the used sheets and use the blank ones for her art, sketching the world as she wished it could be. Her drawings showed Millfield transformed. The abandoned factory became a museum, the empty lot bloomed with gardens, the cracked sidewalks led somewhere magical instead of nowhere special. She drew until her fingers cramped, until the cheap pencils wore down to nubs, until her mother would find her asleep at the kitchen table with graphite smudged across her cheek. The sunsets were free entertainment in Millfield. Eden would sit on their front steps watching the sky turn colors that seemed impossible above such an ordinary place. Orange bled into pink, purple dissolved into navy, and for those few minutes, each evening, their street looked like it belonged in a magazine. She'd race inside to mix watercolors on paper plates, trying to capture those fleeting moments before darkness swallowed them whole. The paintings covered her bedroom walls, dozens of Ohio sunsets, each one, a promise that beautiful things could happen anywhere, even here. High school guidance counselors suggested community college, maybe a degree in business administration. Be practical, Mr. Harrison advised during senior year. Art doesn't pay bills. But Eden had spent 18 years being practical, watching her mother work 3 jobs to keep their lights on. She'd eaten enough generic mac and cheese to know that practical meant settling, and settling meant dying slowly in a town where ambition was treated like arrogance. The scholarship to the Art Institute of Chicago felt like winning a lottery she hadn't known she'd entered. Her portfolio, those thrift store notebook sketches, those paper plate sunsets, had impressed someone enough to offer her a partial ride. Linda cried when the letter came, holding Eden so tight it hurt. "You're going to be everything I couldn't be," she whispered into her daughter's hair. They celebrated with pizza from Little Caesars, a splurge that meant Linda would skip lunch for a week, though she'd never tell Eden that. Chicago hit Eden like cold water on a fevered face. The buildings scraped the sky, the lake stretched beyond the horizon, and art lived everywhere, in galleries, on walls, in the way people dressed and moved. She worked 2 jobs to cover what the scholarship didn't: mornings at a coffee shop near campus, evenings cleaning offices in the Loop. Her hands smelled perpetually of espresso and industrial cleaner, but she didn't care. She was painting, really painting, with real supplies and professors who knew the names of colors she'd only dreamed existed. Her tiny studio apartment above a Vietnamese restaurant became her sanctuary. The walls gradually filled with canvases, not just pretty pictures, but statements, emotions translated into color and texture. She painted the loneliness of being the only student who couldn't afford spring break trips. She painted the exhaustion of 18-hour days. She painted the joy of discovering that she was actually good, maybe, even special, that Mr. Harrison had been wrong about everything. The corporate event was just another catering gig, something to help cover December rent. Eden wore the required black and white uniform, her hair pulled back severely, serving champagne to people who spent more on watches than her mother made in a year. She was navigating the crowd with a tray of drinks when someone stepped backwards suddenly, sending her tray flying. Ginger ale exploded across an expensive suit. Champagne glasses shattered on marble. Floors and Eden stood frozen, calculating how much this mistake would cost her. "I'm so sorry. That was completely my fault," the voice said, before she could even apologize. Brandon Ellis was already laughing, using cocktail napkins to dab ineffectively at his soaked shirt. "I have the spatial awareness of a drunk giraffe. Please tell me you're okay. Did any glass get you?" Eden looked up into brown eyes that held genuine concern, not anger. His suit was ruined. She could tell it cost more than her semester's tuition, but he was asking if she was hurt. "I'm fine," she managed, dropping to gather broken glass before anyone else could step on it. "But your suit needed to be burned anyway," Brandon said, kneeling to help her. "My mother picked it out. Makes me look like an insurance adjuster having a midlife crisis." He paused. I'm 28, by the way, so the midlife crisis is particularly concerning. Despite everything, the mess, the stares, her supervisor approaching with murder in his eyes, Eden laughed. Really laughed, for the first time in weeks. Brandon's hand brushed hers as they reached for the same piece of glass, and something electric passed between them that had nothing to do with static from the carpet. Her supervisor fired her on the spot, which Brandon overheard. "That's ridiculous," he protested. "I knocked into her. If anything, I should be banned from the building for assault with a deadly backbone." But rules were rules, and Eden found herself outside in the Chicago cold, unemployed, 2 weeks before Christmas, wondering how she'd explain this to her mother. Brandon appeared 5 minutes later, coat in hand. "Can I buy you coffee, as an apology, and possibly offer you a job since I just cost you yours?" He looked genuinely distressed. "My company needs someone with an eye for design. The interview process typically doesn't involve me destroying your life first, but here we are." Coffee turned into dinner at a tiny Thai place Eden loved but could rarely afford. Brandon listened, really listened, as she talked about art, about growing up in Millfield, about her mother's sacrifices. He didn't offer pity or patronizing encouragement. Instead, he shared his own struggles with expectation, the weight of family legacy, the loneliness of rooms full of people who only saw dollar signs when they looked at him. "You know what I love about your story?" he said over pad thai. "You're building something from nothing. I'm just trying not to destroy what was handed to me." The vulnerability in his voice made Eden reach across the table, her hand covering his. Neither pulled away. They walked along the lake afterward, December wind cutting through their clothes. Brandon gave her his scarf without asking, wrapping it around her neck with careful attention. They talked about books, about music, about dreams that seemed impossible until you said them out loud. Eden showed him photos of her paintings on her phone, and he studied each one like they belonged in museums. "This one," he said, stopping at a painting of the Millfield sunset. "It's hopeful and heartbroken at the same time, like you're saying goodbye to something you love but can't stay with." His interpretation was so accurate it took her breath away. No one had ever understood her work like that, had seen past the colors to the feelings underneath. The design job he'd mentioned was real. His company needed someone to revamp their corporate communications, make them feel less like monuments to capitalism and more like humans worked there. Eden interviewed the next week, portfolio in hand, trying not to think about how Brandon's eyes had looked in the restaurant lighting. She got the job on merit, her fresh perspective exactly what they needed, though she'd always wonder if Brandon had put in a word. Working in the same building meant accidental meetings by the elevators, shared lunches that started professional and turned personal text messages that began about projects and evolved into conversations that lasted past midnight. Brandon never pushed, never assumed that their growing friendship meant anything more. But Eden felt it. The pull between them, like gravity, had shifted to bring them together. 3 months after the ginger ale incident, Brandon invited her to an actual gallery opening. As friends, he clarified, though his eyes said otherwise. Eden wore a dress she'd made herself. Vintage fabric from a Lincoln Park thrift store transformed into something elegant. When Brandon saw her, his mouth fell open slightly. "You look—" he started, then stopped. "I'm going to ruin this if I say what I'm thinking." "Say it anyway," Eden challenged, feeling brave in her handmade dress. "You look like every painting I've ever wanted to own but knew I wasn't worthy of," he said quietly. That night, surrounded by art that cost more than houses, Eden realized she was falling for someone from a different universe. Brandon moved through that world like he belonged, because he did. But he held her hand like she was the only real thing in a room full of elaborate fakes, introduced her as an artist with such pride it made her chest ache, whispered jokes about the pretentious crowd that made her hide laughter behind champagne glasses. "I don't belong here," she told him on the roof deck, Chicago glittering below them like a circuit board. "Neither do I," Brandon replied. "But with you, I almost feel like I could." Their first kiss tasted like possibility and champagne, like winter air and warm promises. Eden's hands shook as she pulled away, seeing her future rewrite itself in real time. This wasn't part of the plan. falling for someone whose watch cost more than her mother's house, whose family name opened doors Eden didn't even know existed. But Brandon kissed her again, softer this time, and she let herself believe that love could bridge any distance. The relationship that followed felt like learning a new language. Brandon tried to understand her world, visiting her cramped apartment without judgment, eating ramen like it was caviar, sitting on her fire escape talking until sunrise. Eden tried to navigate his charity galas where she felt like an imposter, business dinners where she smiled and nodded while people discussed mergers and acquisitions in a language she didn't speak. "You're doing great," Brandon would whisper during those events, his hand finding hers under the table. But Eden wasn't sure she was. She saw the looks from his colleagues, the way conversation would pause when she mentioned her art, the subtle condescension when people learned where she'd grown up. Brandon never seemed to notice, or if he did, he chose not to acknowledge it. She loved him for his optimism, but sometimes she wondered if he understood how different their worlds really were. Still, there were moments when the gap disappeared entirely. Late nights in her apartment, Brandon in sweatpants helping her stretch canvases, while they debated the merits of abstract versus representational art. Weekend mornings at the farmer's market, him carrying her bags while she selected the cheapest produce. The time her sink broke and he'd shown up with tools, spending 3 hours under her cabinet while she painted, emerging victorious and soaking wet but grinning like he'd conquered Everest. "I love you," he said one night, casual as breathing, while they were washing dishes in her tiny kitchen. Eden froze, a plate suspended in soapy water. "What?" "I love you," Brandon repeated, not casual anymore, turning to face her with complete sincerity. "I've loved you since you laughed at my drunk giraffe comment. I love your paint-stained jeans and your thrift store dresses and the way you see beauty in things other people overlook. I love that you made me remember why any of this matters." Eden set down the plate carefully, her hands shaking. "I love you too," she whispered. "I'm terrified, but I love you too. But love doesn't live in clouds forever. Soon, it must weather storms." Their love existed in the space between two worlds, her paint-stained jeans hanging next to his tailored suits in the closet, her tubes of acrylics sharing counter space with his platinum cufflinks. Eden would come home from the studio with cobalt blue under her fingernails, finding Brandon in their kitchen, still wearing his $1,000 shoes, attempting to cook spaghetti from a recipe he'd printed at his office. He'd kiss her paint-speckled forehead while stirring sauce with the wrong spoon, and somehow this collision of universes made perfect sense. "You have merger documents on the counter," Eden would say, moving legal papers away from tomato sauce splatter. "You have wet brushes in my coffee mug," Brandon would counter, holding up evidence. "That's artistic flavor," she'd insist, and he'd laugh, really laugh, not the polished sound he used in boardrooms, but something raw and genuine that only she could pull from him. Their apartment became a testament to this beautiful contradiction. Eden had insisted on keeping her small place in Lincoln Park instead of moving into Brandon's Gold Coast penthouse. "I need walls that have seen me cry," she'd explained, and he'd understood without question. So he'd gradually migrated into her space, his expensive watch finding a home next to her grandmother, his ceramic dish, his Italian leather briefcase leaning against canvases that smelled of turpentine. Late nights found them on her salvaged couch, eating pasta from mismatched bowls while rain drummed against windows. Brandon would tell her about acquisitions and profit margins, making the brutal world of corporate finance sound almost poetic. Eden would show him works in progress, explaining how certain colors felt like emotions, how brushstrokes could carry weight or lightness, depending on the pressure of her hand. They were teaching each other languages neither had spoken before. "My father says feeling is failure," Brandon admitted one night, 3 months into living together. They were sitting on the fire escape despite the cold, sharing a bottle of wine Eden had bought with a coupon. He built his empire on logic, on calculated risks and emotional distance. He says feelings cloud judgment, make you weak. Eden turned to study his profile against the city lights. "Your father is wrong," she said simply. "Feeling is the foundation. Without it, what's the point of building anything? You construct this perfect life, this profitable existence, and then what? You sit in it alone, counting money that can't love you back. Brandon was quiet for so long she thought she'd offended him. Then he pulled her closer, his voice rough when he finally spoke. You terrify him, you know. My father. He doesn't understand how someone who grew up with nothing can make me question everything he taught me. Good, Eden said, fierce in her conviction. Questions are how we grow. The Sunday dinners at the Ellis estate were exercises in careful navigation. Brandon's mother, Margaret, would serve courses on china that cost more than Eden's annual rent, while his father, Richard, would make comments about Eden's charming background with thinly veiled condescension. Brandon's hand would find hers under the table, squeezing when his father's comments cut too deep, his thumb tracing circles on her palm like secret reassurance. She paints, doesn't she? Richard said during one particularly tense dinner, speaking as if Eden wasn't sitting right there. How creative. I suppose everyone needs hobbies. It's not a hobby, Father, Brandon said, his voice steady, but Eden could feel the tension in his grip. Eden is a professional artist. Her work was featured in the Tribune's art section last month. How lovely, Margaret interjected, trying to smooth over the moment. We should commission something for the summer house, shouldn't we, Richard? Perhaps, Richard said, cutting his steak with surgical precision, though I imagine real art comes at quite a different price point than what we're accustomed to paying. Eden excused herself to the bathroom and cried silently for 5 minutes, trying to repair her makeup before returning to the table. She found Brandon waiting in the hallway. We can leave, he said immediately. Right now. We don't have to stay. Yes, we do, Eden replied, touching his face, because if we leave every time it's hard, we'll never stop running. She didn't know how prophetic those words would become. The proposal came 6 months later, on the shore of Lake Michigan during the first warm day of spring. Brandon had suggested a picnic, which should have been Eden's first clue. He never suggested outdoor eating, claiming sand and food were natural enemies. But there they were, on a blanket Eden recognized from her childhood closet, eating sandwiches from her favorite deli. You brought my mother's picnic blanket, she said, running her fingers over the familiar fabric. How did you? Linda helped, Brandon admitted. I called her last month. We've been conspiring. Eden's eyes filled with tears. The thought of Brandon calling her mother, of the two people she loved most, planning something together, overwhelmed her in ways she couldn't articulate. Eden Parker, Brandon began, and his voice shook slightly. You painted color into my black and white world. You showed me that success without a soul is just expensive failure. You make me want to be the man you already think I am, which is terrifying because you think I'm much better than I actually am. He pulled out a ring, not the massive diamond she'd feared, but something perfect, an antique setting with a sapphire surrounded by small diamonds, the blue almost exactly matching the cobalt paint she loved. This belonged to my grandmother, Brandon continued. The one member of my family who would have adored you. She was an artist too, before she married into the Ellis machine. She painted in secret, in a room my grandfather pretended didn't exist. I found her paintings after she died, landscapes that looked like yours, full of hope despite the circumstances. I think she would want you to have this. Eden was crying openly now, not caring who saw them on the busy lakefront path. Marry me, Brandon said. Not the Ellis empire, not the expectations or the money or the complicated history. Just me, the man who ruins your coffee mugs with legal documents and can't cook pasta without supervision. The man who finally understands that feeling isn't failure, it's the only success that matters. Yes, Eden whispered, then louder. Yes, of course, yes. The ring fit perfectly, as if Brandon's grandmother had somehow known that. Someday a girl from Millfield would need this exact circle of hope. They kissed as joggers veered around them, as seagulls cried overhead, as the lake whispered promises against the shore. If love like this makes you believe again, show it some love. Hit like and tell me in the comments what love means to you. The engagement period became a battlefield Eden hadn't anticipated. Wedding planners spoke in budgets that made her dizzy. 50,000 for flowers alone, another 30 for invitations. Numbers that kept climbing until Eden felt like she was drowning in other people's expectations. "We could do something smaller," she suggested one evening after a particularly exhausting meeting with Margaret's preferred caterer. "Just close family and friends. Maybe a beach ceremony, something intimate." Margaret had laughed, actually laughed, as if Eden had suggested they get married at a fast food restaurant. "Darling, the Ellis family doesn't do intimate. We have 200 people on our business obligation list alone. This wedding is as much about relationships as it is about romance." Brandon tried to find middle ground, but the middle ground between Eden's vision of simplicity and his mother's vision of spectacle was still far beyond anything Eden had imagined. Guest lists expanded, budgets ballooned. The wedding that was supposed to celebrate their love became a production celebrating the Ellis family legacy. "I feel like I'm being erased," Eden told her mother during a phone call 3 months before the wedding. "Every decision gets overruled. Margaret wants white roses, so we're having white roses even though I wanted wildflowers. She wants a string quartet, so the band I wanted is out. She wants the reception at the country club, so the art gallery I suggested is not appropriate." "Baby, you're marrying into their world," Linda said gently. "Sometimes love means compromise," but it didn't feel like a compromise. It felt like surrender. Brandon noticed her pulling away, the way she'd go quiet during planning sessions, how she'd stopped offering opinions because they'd just be dismissed anyway. He tried to compensate with small rebellions, insisting Eden design their invitations herself, choosing a band that played actual music instead of background ambience, writing their own vows despite Margaret's protests about tradition. "We're doing this together," he'd remind her, holding her hand through another meeting about napkin colors. "It's our wedding, not theirs." Except it wasn't. Not really. The wedding belonged to the 200 guests who expected certain standards, to Richard Ellis, who was footing the bill and never let them forget it, to Margaret, who had been planning her son's wedding since he was born. Eden and Brandon were just the centerpieces in someone else's elaborate production. The bachelorette party her bridesmaids threw was sweet, but highlighted the divide. Her college friends suggested a weekend at a cabin, painting and hiking and cheap wine. Brandon's cousin insisted on a spa weekend at a resort that cost more than Eden's semester tuition. They compromised with dinner at an upscale restaurant where Eden's friends looked uncomfortable and Brandon's relatives looked bored. "You're going to be so happy," her best friend Mia said, hugging her goodbye. "Brandon loves you so much. Just remember that when everything else gets crazy, he loves you." Eden held on to those words like a life raft. The rehearsal dinner was the first time all the worlds collided. Linda Parker in her J.C. Penney dress, sitting across from Margaret Ellis in designer silk. Eden's art school friends trying to make conversation with Brandon's Harvard classmates. Richard Ellis giving a toast about welcoming new blood into the family legacy. That made Eden feel like a broodmare being evaluated for genetic contribution. Brandon's toast was better, talking about how Eden had taught him to see the world differently, how she'd made him question everything he thought he knew about success and happiness. But even his beautiful words couldn't erase the feeling that she was, being absorbed into something that would dissolve everything she was. That night, back in their apartment for the last time before the wedding, Eden stood in the bathroom staring at her reflection. Tomorrow she'd become Eden Ellis. Tomorrow she'd walk down an aisle in a dress that cost more than her mother's car, in front of people who'd spent the rehearsal dinner evaluating whether she was worthy of their world. Tomorrow she'd promise forever to the man she loved, while his father watched, already calculating how to minimize the damage of Brandon's poor choice. "You okay?" Brandon asked from the doorway. Eden turned, seeing him rumpled in his pajamas, looking nothing like the polished businessman who'd give speeches at the reception. This was the Brandon she loved, the one who ate cereal for dinner and laughed at terrible jokes and made her feel like she was exactly as she was. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Me too," he said, pulling her close. "But we're going to be fine. Tomorrow we promise to choose each other, and then we get to spend the rest of our lives actually doing it." Eden wanted to believe him. She fell asleep in his arms, trying not to think about the massive production waiting for tomorrow. Trying to focus on the simple fact that she loved him and he loved her, and that should be enough. It had to be enough. But even the strongest vows tremble when the past knocks at the door. The morning of the wedding, Eden woke up to an army of people she didn't know invading her bridal suite. Hairstylists, makeup artists, the wedding coordinator with her clipboard and headset, bridesmaids squealing with mimosas at 10 in the morning. Margaret Ellis presided over it all like a general commanding troops, ensuring every detail matched her vision of perfection. Eden sat in the makeup chair feeling like a doll being prepared for display. The stylist pulled her hair into an elaborate updo that required 47 pins and enough hairspray to survive a hurricane. The makeup artist painted her face into someone Eden barely recognized. Contoured cheekbones, dramatic. Eyes, lips in a shade called Eternal Rose that looked nothing like any rose Eden had ever painted. "You look stunning," Margaret declared, examining her like a sculpture. "The Ellis family will photograph beautifully today. Not you and Brandon, the Ellis family." As if Eden was just another accessory, carefully selected to complement the overall aesthetic. Her mother arrived during the chaos, looking overwhelmed and small in this world of wealth and coordination. Linda Parker stood in the doorway of the bridal suite, taking in the designer gowns and champagne, towers and elaborate flower arrangements, and Eden saw her own fear reflected in her mother's eyes. "Mama," Eden said, crossing the room in her robe, careful not to disturb the hair that had taken 2 hours to construct. Linda hugged her tight, then pulled back to study her face. "You sure about this, baby?" "I love him," Eden whispered. "I know you do," Linda replied. "But do you love this? All of this?" She gestured at the excess surrounding them, at the wedding that had grown into something neither of them recognized. Before Eden could answer, Margaret swept over. "Linda, how wonderful you're here. The mother of the bride should really be getting ready as well. I've arranged for hair and makeup in the adjacent suite." "I'm fine as I am," Linda said quietly. "Nonsense," Margaret insisted. "The photographs need to be cohesive. Come along, we'll have you looking lovely in no time." Eden watched her mother being led away and felt something crack inside her chest. This was it, the moment she'd been dreading, when her old world and new world collided and the old one was found lacking, in need of improvement, not quite good enough for the Ellis family standards. The ceremony itself passed in a blur. Eden walked down an aisle lined with thousands of white roses, Margaret's choice, not hers, toward Brandon, who stood at the altar looking nervous and hopeful and completely unaware of the storm building in her chest. The officiant spoke about sacred bonds and eternal commitment, while 200 guests watched, evaluating, judging, already gossiping about whether this union would last. "I do," Brandon said, his voice clear and certain. "I do," Eden echoed, and meant it, even as doubt coiled around her ribs like a serpent. They signed the marriage certificate in front of witnesses, her hand shaking slightly as she wrote Eden Parker Ellis for the first time. Brandon squeezed her hand, smiling, thinking her trembling was from joy rather than terror. The reception was everything Margaret had envisioned, elegant, expensive, perfectly orchestrated. Eden and Brandon danced their first dance to a song his mother had selected. Something classical and appropriate that meant nothing to either of them. They cut a 5-tier cake that tasted like expensive cardboard. They smiled for endless photographs while the photographer arranged them like mannequins, adjusting angles and lighting to capture the Ellis family legacy in its best light. Eden was making her way back from thanking a table of Brandon's business associates when Richard Ellis intercepted her near the champagne fountain. The patriarch stood alone in his designer tuxedo, holding a glass of scotch and watching the reception with the detached interest of someone observing a successful merger. "Walk with me," he said. Not a request, a command. Eden's stomach dropped, but she followed him to a quiet corner of the country club's terrace, away from the music and laughter and 200 witnesses, to whatever was about to happen. Richard reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila envelope. "I wanted to give you this personally. Seemed appropriate, given the circumstances." "What is it?" Eden asked. though Dredd already knew the answer. "Your prenuptial agreement," Richard said smoothly. "I know Brandon was too sentimental to present it himself, so I handled it for him. Just a formality, really. Standard protection for family assets." Eden's hands shook as she opened the envelope. The document inside was dense with legal language, but certain phrases jumped out like knives. No claim to Ellis family assets for a period of 5 years. Fidelity clauses with liquidated damages. Non-disclosure agreements regarding family, business operations. Waiver of spousal support in the event of dissolution. "We didn't sign a prenup," Eden said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Brandon refused to ask me." "Brandon is young and naive," Richard replied. "He thinks love conquers all, that good intentions are enough to protect what generations of Ellis men have built. Fortunately, I'm neither young nor naive. Look at page 7, dear. Both your signatures properly notarized." Eden flipped to page 7 with trembling fingers. There it was, her signature, looking exactly like her handwriting, next to Brandon's familiar scrawl. A notary stamp. A date from 3 weeks ago, when they'd gone to the courthouse to file their marriage license. "This is impossible," she said. "I never saw this document. I would have remembered signing something like this." "You signed quite a bit of paperwork that day," Richard said, his voice patient, like he was explaining simple concepts to a child. "Marriage licenses, health forms, various administrative documents. Easy to slip one more page into the stack. You were so excited, so in love. You weren't paying attention to what you were signing." The terrace tilted beneath Eden's feet. "You forged this." "I protected my family," Richard corrected. "And the agreement is entirely legal, I assure you. My lawyers are the best money can buy. They've ensured that every clause is enforceable." Eden's mind raced through the implications. 5 years before she could claim anything. 5 years of proving herself worthy, of being on probation in her own marriage. And if she tried to leave before then... "Page 12, Richard said, reading her thoughts. "Should you decide this life isn't for you and attempt to dissolve the marriage before the 5-year mark, you'll leave with nothing. Furthermore, any attempt to contest this agreement will result in legal action. Your mother's mortgage, your sister's student loans, your cousin Rachel's small business loan, all vulnerable to collection if you prove difficult." Eden stared at him. This man who'd just threatened her entire family while his son, her husband, danced with his mother 50 feet away, completely unaware that his father was destroying his marriage during the reception. "Brandon doesn't know about this," she said. "Brandon knows what he needs to know," Richard replied. "He knows I always protect the family. He knows that sometimes love requires practical safeguards. If you truly love my son, you'll understand that this agreement is for everyone's benefit. And if I tell him what you've done..." Richard smiled, and it was the coldest expression Eden had ever seen. "Then I'll tell him what I found during the background check, the medical records you've kept hidden, the prescription medications, the history of mental instability in your family line. I'll tell him how you've been deceiving him about who you really are, and he'll realize I was right to protect him from you." Eden's blood turned to ice. The anxiety medication she'd taken in college, the therapist she'd seen after her father left, the aunt, who'd struggled with depression, all of it weaponized, twisted into evidence of her unworthiness. "You don't know anything about me," she whispered. "I know everything about you," Richard countered. "I know your mother is one mortgage payment away from foreclosure. I know your sister is drowning in debt from a degree she's not using. I know you grew up with nothing and saw my son as a lottery ticket. This prenup simply ensures that if you cash out early, you'll leave the same way you came, with nothing." He drained his scotch and set the glass on the terrace railing. "Enjoy your reception, Mrs. Ellis. Remember, you're part of the family now. That comes with privileges and responsibilities. Don't make me regret welcoming you into our world." Richard Ellis walked away, leaving Eden alone with the manila envelope, and the sound of celebration filtering through the terrace doors. Inside, Brandon was probably looking for her, wondering where his bride had gone. Her mother was attempting conversation with people who saw her as a quaint curiosity. 200 guests were eating food that cost more than most people's monthly salary. celebrating a union that had just been revealed as a trap. Eden's hands shook so violently the papers rattled. She read through the prenup again, looking for loopholes, for any indication that this was a bluff. But every page looked legitimate, every clause carefully worded, both signatures, hers and Brandon's, looking authentic enough to hold up in court. Has Brandon known? Had he been too embarrassed to tell her, slipping it into the courthouse paperwork, hoping she wouldn't notice? Or was this entirely his father's manipulation, forging both their signatures to ensure control? She didn't know. That was the worst part. After 3 years together, after building a life, after promising forever just hours ago, she didn't know if the man she'd married was complicit in his father's scheme or another, victim of Richard Ellis's need to control everything he touched. Eden looked down at her wedding dress, the beaded bodice that had cost more than her mother's car, the train that required 2 bridesmaids to manage. She looked at the sapphire ring on her finger, Brandon's grandmother's legacy, a symbol of love from a woman who'd also married into the Ellis family and spent her life painting in secret, hiding her true self in rooms her husband pretended didn't exist. Was that her future? 5 years of probation, then what? A lifetime of being managed, controlled, shaped into an acceptable version of herself that fits the Ellis family mold. Her art relegated to hobby status, her opinions dismissed in favor of Margaret's preferences, her entire existence reduced to producing acceptable heirs and maintaining proper appearances. Through the terrace doors, she could see Brandon dancing with his mother, laughing at something Margaret said. He looked happy, relaxed, completely unaware that his father had just threatened his wife's entire family during their wedding reception. He looked like a man who belonged in this world, who'd never questioned whether the privilege was worth the price. Eden had been questioning it for months. Now she had her answer. She walked back into the reception on autopilot, smiling mechanically at guests who stopped her to offer congratulations. She danced with Brandon when the coordinator announced it was time, letting him spin her around the floor while the photographer captured what looked like joy, but felt like drowning. "You okay?" Brandon whispered during the dance. "You seem distant, just overwhelmed," Eden lied. "It's a lot, I know," he said, pulling her closer. "But in a few hours we'll be alone. Just us. No more performance, no more expectations. Just you and me starting our life together. Except it wouldn't be just them. It would be them and the prenup. Them and Richard's threats. Them and 5 years of proving she deserved what she'd apparently stolen by daring to love above her station. It would be them and the inevitable dissolution of everything she was until only an acceptable Ellis wife remained. The reception continued. Toasts were made, Richard praising Brandon's judgment while never mentioning Eden's name, Margaret welcoming Eden to the family with the warmth of someone accepting a necessary but not particularly desired acquisition. Eden's mother tried to give a toast but got so flustered by the microphone and the crowd that she simply said, "I love you, baby. Be happy," and sat down to scattered polite applause. By 11 p.m., Eden had made her decision. She waited until Brandon was occupied with his college friends, then slipped away to the bridal suite. Inside, she found the bag she'd hidden 2 weeks ago, just in case she'd told herself, though some part of her had known this moment was coming. Jeans, hoodie, sneakers, cash, a burner phone still in its package. She changed quickly, stuffing the wedding dress in the closet where housekeeping would find it tomorrow. The sapphire ring was harder. Eden stood at the mirror, twisting it on her finger, this symbol of a love that had been real even if everything else was lies. She thought about leaving it in the suite, about making a clean break. But something made her put it in her pocket instead, not to keep, but because abandoning it felt like erasing the one good thing in all of this chaos. She took out a piece of hotel stationery and wrote quickly, before she could change her mind, "I'm sorry. I can't be what they need me to be. You deserve someone who fits your world. I never will. Please don't look for me. Be happy. I love you, but love isn't enough." She left the note on the pillow where her head should have been and walked out of the bridal suite. At 2:15 a.m., while her husband of 8 hours danced at a reception celebrating their future, The hotel lobby was empty except for the night desk clerk, who nodded politely. The doorman held the door, wishing her good night without questioning why a bride was leaving her own wedding in jeans and a hoodie. She walked into the Rhode Island night, toward the taxi she'd called, toward the bus station, toward anywhere that wasn't here. Her phone, her real phone, the one with Brandon's number and her mother's contact, and 3 years of memories went into an airport trash can 3 hours later. The burner stayed off. Emergency use only, though she couldn't imagine what emergency would be worth the risk of being found. By sunrise, Eden Parker Ellis had ceased to exist. In her place was Emily Porter, a woman with no history and no future, just a present measured in bus tickets and cheap motels and the slowly dawning realization that she was pregnant. To understand how forever can end in a single night, we must first witness the moment it shatters. Brandon Ellis became a ghost haunting his own life. The tabloids feasted on his tragedy for weeks. Billionaire's bride vanishes, runaway bride leaves Ellis heir at tea, altar, where ice Eden Parker. Each headline, another cut to his already shredded dignity. He moved through press conferences with practiced composure, delivering prepared statements about respecting Eden's privacy and focusing on the future. Behind closed doors, he was drowning in the wreckage of what should have been. The wedding suite remained untouched for 2 weeks before his mother finally intervened. Margaret Ellis arrived with a team of assistants, packing away Eden's abandoned dress. The scattered rose petals now brown and crisp, the champagne that had gone flat. Brandon watched from the doorway as they erased evidence of his humiliation, each folded napkin and boxed centerpiece, another acknowledgement that she wasn't coming back. The investigators have found nothing substantial, his father informed him during a tense meeting in Richard's study. She's either very clever or had help. The trail goes cold at the airport. It's time to move forward, Brandon. File for annulment. Claim abandonment. Put this embarrassment behind us. Did you do something to her? Brandon asked, his voice deadly quiet. Rachel said she saw you talking to Eden during the reception. Said Eden looked upset afterward. Richard's expression remained neutral. I welcomed her to the family. If she found that upsetting, perhaps it confirms she was never suited for this life. What did you say to her? Brandon pressed. Does it matter? Richard countered. She's gone. Whether I said something or nothing, she made her choice. She chose to run rather than face her responsibilities as Ellis' wife. That tells you everything you need to know about her character. Brandon wanted to flip the mahogany desk, to scream that Eden had more character, in one paint-stained fingernail than the entire Ellis family possessed combined. But exhaustion won over rage. He stood, straightened his tie, and delivered the words that would define the next 5 years. I'm done, he said simply. Done with what? Richard asked. All of it. The company, the family business, the legacy you've spent my entire life trying to force me into. I'm resigning from the board, effective immediately. Find another heir to mold into your image. I'm finished being one. Richard's face darkened. You're upset. Take some time, then we'll discuss. There's nothing to discuss, Brandon interrupted. You spent 3 years trying to convince me that Eden wasn't good enough for this family. Turns out you were right. She was too good for us. Too honest, too genuine, too human for the Ellis machine. And I was too weak to protect her from it. He walked out of that study and didn't return for 5 years. The first year was survival. Brandon moved into a modest apartment in Lincoln Park. Not the penthouse his name could command, but something. Close to the neighborhood where he'd fallen in love with a girl who painted sunsets on paper plates. He started his own company, Tech Bridge Solutions, focused on technology. That actually helped people rather than just generating profit. His father called it betrayal. His mother called it a phase. Brandon called it becoming someone who might have deserved Eden, even though he'd lost her. The work consumed him. 18-hour days, sleeping in his office, living on coffee and whatever his assistant brought him. The company grew despite, or perhaps because of, his single-minded focus. He poured every ounce of grief and rage and self-loathing into building something that mattered, something Eden might have been proud of if she'd been there to see it. But she wasn't there. She was gone, vanished as completely as if she'd never existed. Brandon's therapist, Dr. Whitman, suggested he was avoiding grief by drowning in work. "You need to process the abandonment," she said during their third session. "What's to process?" Brandon replied, staring out her office window at the Chicago skyline. "She left. I survived. That's the story." "Is it?" Dr. Whitman challenged. "Or is the story that you lost the love of your life and instead of mourning, you're punishing yourself by working yourself to death?" Brandon stopped going to therapy after that session. Mourning felt like giving up, like accepting that Eden was truly gone. As long as he stayed busy, stayed focused, stayed moving forward, he could pretend there was still a chance she might come back. The letters started 6 months after the wedding. Brandon would write to Eden late at night when sleep wouldn't come, addressing them to the woman he'd known, not the stranger who'd vanished. He wrote about the company, about his father's heart attack that had happened 4 months after Brandon quit, stress-induced, the doctors said, though Brandon suspected it was rage that his carefully constructed empire was crumbling without an heir to maintain it. He wrote about missing her, about the way her paintings still hung in his apartment because removing them felt like erasing her completely. He wrote about the guilt, wondering what he'd missed, what signs he'd ignored, how he'd failed to protect her from whatever had driven her away. The letters filled a drawer in his home office, each one a message in a bottle thrown into an ocean that had swallowed her whole. He never sent them. There was nowhere to send them to. 800 miles away, Eden Parker no longer existed. She'd become Emily Porter, a name chosen from a baby book at a gas station in South Carolina while eating vending machine crackers and trying not to cry. The small coastal town of Folly Beach welcomed her without questions, used to transients and seasonal workers who appeared and disappeared with the tourist tides. She rented a cottage so small the bedroom and living room were essentially the same space, painted white but stained with salt air and years of neglect. The pregnancy test turned positive 3 weeks after her arrival. Emily, she had to think of herself as Emily now, had to become Emily completely or risk being found. Sat on the bathroom floor of a gas station staring at the plus sign until her vision blurred. She'd been so careful with her birth control. But the stress of the wedding, the chaos of planning, something had failed. The irony felt cosmic, running from one life only to carry its evidence inside her. She had no health insurance, no medical history under her new name, no idea how to navigate pregnancy while pretending to be someone else. The free clinic in Charleston became her lifeline. The intake coordinator, a woman named Dolores with kind eyes and no-nonsense attitude, didn't ask questions Eden couldn't answer. "You running from something, honey?" Dolores asked during the first appointment, her voice gentle. Emily's throat tightened. "Someone. But I had good reasons." "Most women who end up here do," Dolores replied. "We'll take care of you. You and your baby." The ultrasound at 8 weeks revealed twins. Emily stared at the monitor showing 2 tiny heartbeats, 2 futures she'd never planned for, 2 lives that deserved better than a mother hiding from her past. "Twins run in families," the ultrasound technician said cheerfully. "Does either side have multiples?" Emily had no idea. She knew nothing about Brandon's family medical history beyond what she'd observed. At Sunday dinners, his father's heart condition, his mother's migraine headaches. She didn't know about twins, about genetic conditions, about any of the things expectant mothers were supposed to discuss with their partners. She cried in the parking lot for 20 minutes, then drove to the beach and made a promise to the ocean and the 2 lives growing inside her. "I'll figure this out. We'll be okay. I'll make sure you're okay." Money became an immediate crisis. The cash she'd saved wouldn't last through a pregnancy, let alone support 3 lives. Emily began painting again, setting up a makeshift studio in the corner of her cottage. But instead of the abstract emotional pieces she'd created as Eden, she painted what tourists wanted: beach scenes, lighthouses, seascapes in colors that felt like betrayals of her artistic soul but sold for enough to buy groceries. She found work at a beachfront restaurant called the Sandbar, waiting tables until her swelling belly made carrying trays impossible. The owner, Carl, was a retired Navy man who asked no questions and paid cash under the table. When Emily's pregnancy became obvious, he switched her to hostess duties without cutting her pay. "My daughter went through a rough patch once," Carl said when Emily tried to thank him. "Someone helped her when she needed it. I figure I'm just passing it forward." These small mercies from strangers felt like signs that maybe she hadn't made the worst mistake of her life. Maybe running had been survival, not cowardice. Maybe protecting her children from the Ellis family machine was worth the cost of losing their father. The twins arrived during a November storm, 8 weeks premature and fighting for every breath. Noah came first, screaming his indignation at the early eviction, his tiny fists clenched, like he was ready to fight the world. Lily followed 4 minutes later, silent in a way that made the doctors move with frightening speed. She was blue, not breathing, a fragile thing that looked too small to survive. Emily watched from the delivery table as they worked on her daughter, as Noah wailed in an incubator. Nearby, as her entire world narrowed to the terrible silence where Lily's cry should have been. Then, miracle of miracles, a gasp, a cough, a weak mule that grew stronger with each second. "She's a fighter," the NICU nurse told Emily hours later, watching Lily's tiny chest rise and fall on the ventilator. "They both are. 32-weekers usually struggle more than this. Your babies have strong genes." Ellis thought Emily thought but didn't say. Brandon's stubborn determination, his refusal to accept defeat, living on in children he didn't know existed. The NICU became Emily's world for 8 weeks. She pumped breast milk in hospital bathrooms, sang lullabies to incubators, learned to change diapers through porthole openings designed for hands much steadier than hers. Carl held her hostess position open. Dolores from the clinic visited twice, bringing toiletries and encouragement. The hospital social worker tried to discuss support options, WIC, Medicaid, programs for single mothers, but each form required information Emily couldn't provide without risking discovery. "I'll manage," she kept saying, though she had no idea how. Noah and Lily came home 2 days before Christmas, each weighing barely 5 pounds, requiring feeding every 2 hours and constant monitoring. Emily's cottage became a warren of bottles and diapers, baby swings and second-hand cribs. She learned to function on 90-minute sleep intervals, to nurse twins simultaneously, to recognize the difference between hungry cries and tired cries, and something's wrong cries that sent her racing to the emergency room. Money evaporated faster than she could earn it. Formula for 2, diapers by the case, doctor visits that couldn't be avoided. Emily painted during their naps, sold beach scenes to tourists who had no idea they were buying pieces of a shattered fairy tale. She waitressed when Carl could find her shifts and babysitters were available, usually Dolores's teenage granddaughter who charged less than Emily could afford, but more than she should spend. The twins' first year was a blur of exhaustion and love and bone-deep terror that she was failing them. Noah developed colic, screaming for hours while Emily walked circles around the tiny cottage. Lily had reflux, spitting up so frequently that Emily went through 6 outfit changes a day. They got sick constantly, daycare germs, beach town viruses, the normal illnesses of childhood made terrifying because Emily had no safety net, no family to call, no partner to share the burden. But they also laughed. Noah's first giggle came at 4 months, a sound so pure it made Emily cry. Lily learned to roll over at 5 months, looking so proud of herself that Emily took 17 photos. They grew despite their rough start, meeting milestones and developing. Personalities, Noah bold and curious, Lily cautious and analytical. Emily documented everything in a journal she kept hidden under her mattress. First smiles, first words mama for both, thank God. First steps taken while holding onto the coffee table. She wrote it all down, knowing that someday she might need to explain to them why their father wasn't there for these moments. Knowing that someday they'd ask questions she didn't have good answers for. Back in Chicago, Brandon stood at his office window on the twins' first birthday. Not that he knew it was their birthday, not that he knew they existed. He stared out at the city lights, thinking about Eden as he did every November, wondering where she was, if she was happy, if she ever thought about him. His company had just closed a major contract. The board wanted to celebrate with champagne and congratulations. Brandon had excused himself, claiming fatigue, and stood alone in his office wondering why success felt so hollow. His mother called, as she did every few months, trying to bridge the gap Brandon had created by leaving the family business. "Your father is asking about you," she said. "His health isn't good, Brandon. I think he wants to reconcile. Then he can apologize," Brandon replied. "For whatever he said to Eden, for driving away the only person who ever made me want to be better than the Ellis name." "She left you," Margaret reminded him, not unkindly. "At some point, you need to accept that and move on." But moving on felt like betrayal. Moving on meant accepting that Eden was truly gone, that the love that had transformed his entire worldview had been one-sided or insufficient, or not strong enough to survive whatever test his family had subjected her to. Brandon had built a successful company, yes. He'd become the man he thought Eden would have been proud of, ethical, generous, focused on impact over profit. But he'd built it all in her absence. A monument to a love that hadn't survived contact with reality. He dated occasionally, when loneliness became too heavy to carry alone. Smart women, kind women. Women who had their lives together and weren't running from anything. But none of them were Eden. None of them understood why he kept her paintings on his walls. Why he couldn't bear to donate her art supplies that still sat in boxes in his closet. Why he flinched whenever someone mentioned weddings or forever or happily ever after. "You're stuck," his friend Michael told him during a rare night out. 5 years, Brandon. At some point, you need to accept that she's not coming back." "I know she's not coming back," Brandon replied. "Knowing doesn't make it hurt less." Meanwhile, in Folly Beach, Emily Porter sang lullabies to 2 5-year-olds who were growing too big for their toddler beds. Noah wanted stories about brave knights. Lily wanted facts about ocean creatures. And both of them were starting to ask questions about the father who existed only in vague explanations and careful omissions. "Where's our daddy?" Noah asked one night during the bedtime routine. Emily's heart clenched. "Your daddy, he lives far away, but he loved you very much, even before you were born. Why doesn't he visit?" Lily asked, her analytical mind already poking holes in the story. "It's complicated, sweetheart," Emily said, defaulting to the answer all parents used when truth was too heavy for small shoulders. "Someday, when you're older, I'll explain better. Do we look like him?" Noah pressed. Emily studied their faces, Brandon's chin on Noah, his eyes on Lily, his stubborn determination visible in both. "Yes," she whispered. "You look just like him." That night, after the twins were asleep, Emily pulled out the sapphire ring she'd kept hidden for 5 years. She told herself she kept it for the twins, as proof of their father's love, as evidence that she hadn't made them up entirely. But the truth was simpler and more painful. She kept it because letting go of the ring meant letting go of the last physical connection to the man she'd loved and left. She slipped it on her finger, feeling the familiar weight, remembering the proposal on Lake Michigan when forever had seemed possible. Then she took it off, put it back in its hiding place, and went to bed alone, in a cottage too small for 3 people, but exactly right for the family they'd become. 5 years of parallel lives. Brandon building empires from grief, Emily building a family from necessity. Both of them carrying love that had nowhere to go except into the work of surviving each day. Neither knew that fate was already arranging their collision, that destinies delayed are not destinies. Denied that sometimes the universe waits until you're ready before it gives you what you need. 5 years later, their worlds would collide again. This time, fate wasn't asking permission. The Tidewater Gallery sat on a corner of Folly Beach, where salt-weathered buildings met tourist shops, its white clapboard exterior promising local art and overpriced beach memories. Brandon Ellis had no intention of stopping there. He'd driven to South Carolina on impulse, escaping another charity gala his mother had orchestrated, another evening of manufactured conversation with women who saw dollar signs instead of damaged goods. The coastal highway had called to him at 2 in the morning, and he'd followed it south without destination or purpose. But something about the gallery made him slow down. Maybe it was the sculpture visible through the glass, a bronze figure that looked like it was either reaching for something or pushing it away. Maybe it was exhaustion making him seek shelter from the relentless sunshine. Maybe it was fate disguising itself as coincidence. He parked his rental car and walked inside, telling himself he'd browse for 5 minutes before continuing his journey to nowhere. The gallery smelled of coffee and sea air, driftwood sculptures sharing space with watercolors of pelicans and lighthouses. Tourist art, mostly, competent but soulless, the kind of work that decorated beach houses and gathered dust. Brandon moved through the front room with polite disinterest until something stopped him cold in the doorway to the back gallery. The painting hung on the far wall, small enough to miss if you weren't paying attention. But Brandon was always paying attention to art now, trained by years of seeing her vision. In every museum, every street corner, every sunset that looked almost right but not quite, this painting was different. This painting breathed. It showed a storm over the ocean, dark clouds that could have been threatening or protective depending on how you looked. The brushwork had that particular quality, thick in some places, whisper thin. In others, colors layered until they created depth that pulled you inside. But what stopped his heart was the dual sunrise barely visible on the horizon. 2 small points of light breaking through darkness, painted with such hope it felt like prayer. Brandon moved closer, his hands shaking. The signature in the corner read EP, not Eden Parker, but those initials felt like her handwriting carved into his ribs. He knew these brushstrokes the way some people knew voices, could identify her technique in the way. The light seemed to drip down the canvas like liquid sunshine, illuminating everything it touched. Beautiful piece, isn't it? The gallery owner appeared at his elbow, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and paint under her fingernails. Local artist. Very private, won't even display her real name. But her work sells faster than anything else we carry. How much? Brandon asked, his voice rough. That one's not for sale, the woman said apologetically. The artist keeps certain pieces in the gallery for display only. Says some stories aren't meant to be owned by strangers. Brandon pulled out his wallet. Name your price. Any price. The gallery owner studied him with sudden interest. She said someone might come looking someday. Said if a man asked about the dual sunrise, I should tell him it's already spoken for. She paused. Are you him? Before Brandon could answer, the gallery door chimed. He turned reflexively, and the world stopped. Eden stood in the doorway, her hand reaching back to hold the door open for 2 children, a boy and a girl, maybe 4 or 5 years old, wearing matching yellow raincoats despite the clear sky. She was thinner than he remembered, her hair longer, pulled back in a messy bun that looked nothing like the careful style she'd worn to board meetings and family dinners. She wore paint-stained jeans and a faded sweater, looking exactly like the woman he'd fallen in love with before his world had complicated hers. Their eyes met across 20 feet of hardwood floor and 5 years of silence. Eden's face went white. The color drained so completely that Brandon instinctively moved toward her, afraid she might collapse. But she held steady, one hand gripping the doorframe, the other still holding the door for the children who were now looking up at her with concern. Mama, the little girl asked, her voice high and uncertain. You okay? Brandon froze. Mama. The word detonated in his chest like a grenade. Brandon, Eden whispered, his name cracking in the middle like something broken. Her eyes darted to the children, then back to him, and he saw panic there, raw and desperate. The look of someone whose past had just kicked down her carefully constructed door. The boy noticed Brandon staring and stepped partially in front of his sister, protective instinct already formed despite his size. Who's that, Mama? Brandon couldn't breathe. I couldn't think, could only stare at these children, this boy with his stubborn chin, this girl with eyes that looked familiar in a way that made his knees weak. They had Eden's delicate bone structure, her artist's fingers, but something in their features whispered his own reflection back at him. Please, Eden said, and it came out like a prayer or a plea or both. Not here. The gallery owner looked between them, understanding dawning on her face. Emily, she said gently, using a name that wasn't Eden's. Why don't you use the back office? I'll watch the little ones. No, Eden said quickly, her grip tightening on the children. We need to go. We can't. But the boy was staring at Brandon with unnerving intensity, his head tilted in question. You look sad, he announced with the brutal honesty of childhood. Are you lost? The question hit Brandon like a physical blow. Was he lost? He'd been lost for 5 years, wandering through a life that looked successful from the outside while feeling like a stranger in his own skin. He'd been lost since the morning he woke up to an empty wedding suite and a ring on a pillow where his wife should have been. Noah, Eden said, her voice strained. That's not polite. Noah. Brandon tested the name silently, watching the boy who might be his son, who was almost certainly his son, unless the universe was cruel enough to make coincidence look this much like destiny. I'm Brandon, he said, kneeling to the boy's eye level because standing felt too aggressive, too much like the towering Ellis presence his father had perfected. And yes, I think I might be a little lost. We're good at finding things, the little girl offered, her voice softer than her brother's, but just as curious. Mama says we're detectives of lost treasures. Lily, don't, Eden started, but Brandon was already looking up at her, and the name registered. Noah and Lily, 2 children. Twins, obviously, from their matching heights and the way they moved in unconscious synchronization. Born roughly 9 months after a wedding that never happened, after a honeymoon. That was cancelled, after a bride who disappeared into the night. How old are they? Brandon asked, still kneeling, his voice barely above a whisper. Eden's eyes filled with tears. Brandon, please, not like this. How old, Eden? He stood now, and she flinched at the sound of her real name spoken aloud. After years of being Emily Porter, ghost of the girl she'd been. 5, she whispered. They turned 5 3 weeks ago. Their birthday is November 7th. Brandon did the math in his head, counting backward from November to their wedding night in June, 5.5 years ago. The numbers aligned with brutal precision. These children, Noah with his protective stance, Lily with her gentle curiosity, they were his, had been his all along, while he'd been building empires and writing unsent letters and trying to forget the woman who'd carved herself into his DNA. You knew, he said, and it wasn't a question. You knew when you left. No, Eden said quickly, fiercely. I found out 3 weeks after I ran. By then, I was already gone, already someone else. I couldn't, her voice broke. I couldn't come back. Couldn't or wouldn't. The anger surprised him, erupting from a place he'd buried under 5 years of professional composure and emotional lockdown. The gallery owner cleared her throat. Okay, how about we all take a breath? Emily, Eden, whoever you are, honey, take this man somewhere private before your children start asking questions you're not ready to answer. I'll keep Noah and Lily entertained with the pottery studio out back. Can we make stuff? Noah asked, immediately distracted. Can we make anything we want? Lily added, her eyes lighting up with possibility. Anything your heart's desire, the gallery owner promised, already herding them toward the back room. Your mama and this gentleman need to have a grown-up conversation. Eden watched her children disappear through the doorway, her body language screaming flight risk. Brandon positioned himself between her and the exit without making it obvious. A strategic move he'd learned in boardrooms applied to the most important negotiation of his life. Don't run again, he said quietly. Please, whatever else happens, don't take them away before I understand. Eden's face crumpled. You weren't supposed to find us. I was so careful. I changed my name, I stayed off social media. I never registered them for school under Ellis. Ellis? Brandon interrupted. You gave them my name? Their birth certificates say Parker, Eden admitted. But Noah Ellis Parker and Lily Eden Parker. I couldn't. They deserved to have you somewhere, even if it was just ink on paper no one would see. The parking lot outside the gallery was empty, except for his rental car, and a minivan so old it might have predated the twins. Eden led him there on autopilot, unlocking it with shaking hands, and sitting in the driver's seat without inviting him in. Brandon opened the passenger door anyway, sliding into a vehicle that smelled like crayons and goldfish crackers, and a life he'd been excluded from. Talk, he said. You owe me that much. Eden gripped the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping her anchored to earth. I panicked. The night of the wedding, your father cornered me during the reception. He said things about prenuptial agreements I'd never seen, about how I'd signed away my right to anything if the marriage didn't last 5 years. He said I was the latest in a long line of fortune hunters, that you'd figure it out eventually, and I'd be thrown out with nothing. Brandon's blood ran cold. What prenup? We didn't have a prenup. I refused to ask you to sign one. That's what I thought, Eden said, tears streaming down her face now. But he showed me documents, Brandon. They had my signature, your signature, a notary stamp. He said you'd been too embarrassed to tell me, that you'd slipped it into the pile of wedding paperwork we signed at the courthouse. And I believed him because, why wouldn't I? I was this girl from nowhere who'd somehow tricked a billionaire into loving her. Of course there were safeguards. Of course it was too good to be true. So you ran, Brandon said flatly. So I ran, Eden confirmed. I was going to disappear for a few days, clear my head, figure out what was real. Then I found out about the twins, and disappearing for a few days turned into hiding for 5 years because how could I come back? How could I explain that I'd stolen your children because I was too stupid to verify documents before destroying both our lives? Brandon sat in silence, processing. His father's cruelty shouldn't surprise him. Richard Ellis had built an empire on manipulation and strategic destruction of anything that threatened his control. But forging legal documents to drive away his son's bride crossed a line Brandon hadn't known existed. The prenup was fake, he said carefully. My father lied to you. I know that now, Eden whispered. I've known for years, but by the time I figured it out, I was Emily Porter with 2 babies and a life built on lies. How do I come back from that? You should have told me, Brandon said finally. However scared you were, however convinced I'd hate you, you should have told me about them. I know, Eden said. I know, and I'm sorry, and those words mean nothing because sorry doesn't give you back 5 years of birthdays and first steps and nights when they were sick, and I was terrified and alone. She turned to look at him fully for the first time. But I'm not sorry they exist. I'm not sorry I kept them safe and loved, and away from a family that would have treated them like assets instead of children. I'm not my father, Brandon said, and the words came out sharper than intended. I know, Eden replied, but when I left, I wasn't sure you knew that. Through the gallery window, they could see Noah and Lily at the pottery wheels. There, small hands covered in clay, laughing at something the gallery owner had said. They looked happy, loved, whole despite the father-shaped hole in their lives. They're incredible, Brandon said softly. You raised incredible humans. They ask about their father sometimes, Eden admitted. I told them he was a good man who loved them but couldn't be with us. Noah accepted that. Lily keeps asking why, and I never have a good answer because Mama was a coward, doesn't feel age-appropriate. Can I meet them? Brandon asked. Properly, I mean. Not as a stranger in a gallery, but as their father. Fear flashed across Eden's face. Brandon, we can't just... They don't know who you are. What if they hate me for keeping you away? What if you decide you want custody and I lose them because I ran? I'm not going to take them from you, Brandon said firmly. Whatever else happens, whatever we become or don't become, you're their mother. You've been there for 5 years. I'm just asking for a chance to be something too. Eden studied his face, searching for dishonesty or hidden agendas, the survival instinct of someone who'd learned to trust carefully. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because she nodded slowly. Okay, she whispered. But we go slow. We haven't told them yet. Let them get to know you as Brandon, as a friend. Then, when they're ready, when I'm ready, we'll explain. Deal, Brandon said, though every cell in his body wanted to march into that gallery and claim his children immediately to make up for lost time in one dramatic revelation. But Eden was right. This required patience, care, the kind of slow building. That made foundations strong enough to support whatever came next. If your heart just skipped a beat, pass it on. Share this story so someone else remembers that love can survive time itself. They sat in the minivan for another 10 minutes, filling in gaps. Eden's life as Emily Porter, Brandon's company and his break from, the family business, the parallel paths they'd walked, without knowing the other, was just a gallery visit away from collision. I never stopped thinking about you, Brandon admitted. Even when I was trying to move on, trying to build something new, you were always there. The paintings on my walls, your art supplies in my closet, the way every sunset looked wrong because it wasn't your colors. I never Googled you, Eden confessed. I was afraid that seeing your life continue without me would break something that was barely holding together, so I focused on the immediate, teaching Noah colors, helping Lily stack blocks, making mac and cheese necklaces that I wore to work, like they were pearls. Mac and cheese necklaces? Brandon asked, a smile tugging at his mouth for the first time in the conversation. You'll see, Eden said, and the promise in those words felt like hope beginning to take root in scorched earth. They walked back into the gallery together, not touching but not strangers either. Something in between, something fragile and new that didn't have a name yet. The gallery owner looked up from where she was helping Noah attach a handle to a misshapen clay cup. Everything okay? She asked. Getting there, Eden replied. Brandon knelt beside the pottery wheel where Lily was concentrating intensely on a bowl that looked more like a UFO. Can I try? He asked. Lily looked up, considered, then nodded solemnly. But you have to be gentle. Clay is temperamental. I'll be very gentle, Brandon promised, and placed his hands beside hers on the clay, feeling it spin beneath their fingers, beginning the slow work of building something together. What happens after forever returns unannounced? The seaside cafe sat at the end of a weathered pier, its tables scattered, across warped wooden planks that had survived decades of storms. Brandon and Eden sat across from each other while Noah and Lily played on the beach below, supervised by Rachel, Eden's cousin who'd driven down from Charlotte the moment she heard Brandon had found them. The coffee between them had gone cold an hour ago, untouched, while words poured out like blood from reopened wounds. I called you, Brandon said, his voice raw from talking. Every day for 6 months, I called your number hoping you'd answer. I hired investigators who found nothing because you'd become a ghost. I convinced myself you were dead, because that hurt less than thinking you chose to leave me. Eden's tears had dried into salt tracks on her cheeks. I threw my phone away at the airport, cut off everyone who knew me as Eden Parker. Your father said if I contacted you, he'd make sure I never saw daylight outside a courtroom. He said he had lawyers who could prove I'd married you under false pretenses, that I'd manipulated you for money. I was 26 years old, pregnant and terrified. You thought I'd believe that? Brandon leaned forward, his hands gripping the table edge. You thought I'd rather live without you than fight for you? The question hung between them like an accusation and a plea. Eden looked away, watching her children chase waves, their laughter carrying on the ocean breeze. I thought you'd choose your family over me, she said quietly. You always did, Brandon. Every Sunday dinner where your father humiliated me and you stayed silent. Every board meeting where they dismissed my opinions and you didn't defend me. I loved you desperately, but I also knew where I ranked in your world, below the Ellis name, below the company legacy, below the life you'd been groomed to lead since birth. Brandon flinched like she'd struck him. That's not fair, isn't it? Eden turned back to face him, and her eyes held something harder than tears. I'm not saying you didn't love me. I know you did, but your father knew something I didn't want to admit. When it came down to choosing, you'd protect the empire. So he pushed, and I removed myself before you had to make that choice. The words settled between them like broken glass, sharp and impossible to clean up without drawing blood. Brandon sat back, his mind wanting to argue, to present evidence of his devotion. But 5 years of distance had given him clarity he'd lacked at 28. She wasn't entirely wrong. I was a coward, he finally admitted. I thought keeping peace at family dinners was the same as protecting you. I thought if I just waited until after the wedding, until we were officially united, then I'd have the standing to tell my father to back off. I was playing chess while you were drowning. I should have talked to you, Eden countered. That night, When your father showed me those documents, I should have come to you instead of running. But I was so scared, Brandon. Not just of him, but of finding out he was right, that you'd always choose them over me. I left the family business, Brandon said abruptly. 3 months after you disappeared, walked out of a board meeting and never went back. My father had a heart attack 6 months later, stress-induced, the doctors said. Though I think it was rage that his heir apparently had abandoned ship. Eden's eyes widened. You left Ellis Tech. I started my own company, smaller, cleaner, focused on technology that actually helps people instead of just generating profit. My father called it betrayal. I called it becoming someone who deserved you, even though I thought I'd never see you again. Brandon laughed bitterly. Turns out being the man you needed only mattered when you were there to witness it. They sat in silence, watching their children. Noah had found a stick and was drawing elaborate designs in the wet sand. Lily collected shells, examining each one with scientific precision before adding it to her bucket or discarding it back to the beach. They're incredible, Brandon said softly. You raised incredible humans. They ask about their father sometimes, Eden admitted. I told them he was a good man who loved them but couldn't be with us. Noah accepted that. Lily keeps asking why, and I never have a good answer. Can I be part of their lives? Brandon asked. Not take over, not demand immediate custody or dramatic revelations. Just be there. For school events and bedtime stories and teaching Noah how to throw a baseball, even though I'm terrible at sports. Fear and hope warred on Eden's face. What about us? What are we? I don't know, Brandon said honestly. 5 years ago, we were husband and wife for 8 hours. Now we're 2 people who loved each other once and hurt each other badly and have 2 children who deserve better than our mistakes. Maybe we start there and see what grows. Eden nodded slowly. Slow. We go slow. Glacially slow, Brandon agreed. The first visit happened 2 days later. Brandon showed up at Eden's cottage with a bag full of age-appropriate gifts he'd panic bought. At Target, building blocks, art supplies, a stuffed robot that Noah immediately claimed. He sat on the floor of their tiny living room, awkward in his expensive jeans, while 2 5-year-olds subjected him to intense interrogation. Why are your shoes so shiny? Lily asked, poking his leather loafers. Do you know how to build stuff? Noah demanded, dumping Legos between them. Can you do a cartwheel? Lily tried, already attempting one and failing spectacularly. Have you ever seen a real dinosaur? Noah challenged. Brandon answered each question with careful honesty, and gradually the children's suspicion melted into curiosity. By the end of the afternoon, Noah was showing him the spaceship design he'd created, and Lily was teaching him the difference between cumulus and cirrus clouds using cotton balls and construction paper. You're good with them, Eden said from the kitchen doorway, watching Brandon help Noah attach a particularly difficult Lego piece. They make it easy, Brandon replied. They have your creativity, and apparently my need to understand how everything works. The visits became routine. Brandon rented a beach house 2 miles from Eden's cottage, extending his South Carolina stay indefinitely. He came over for breakfast, stayed for dinner, and read bedtime stories in voices that made the twins giggle. Eden watched him fall in love with his children in real time, and something in her chest that had been locked tight for 5 years began to open. 3 weeks into this new normal, the letter arrived. Eden found it slipped under her door on a Tuesday morning while walking the twins to their preschool. Plain white envelope, no return address, her fake name typed across the front. Inside, a single sheet of paper with a message that stopped her heart. Emily Porter is fiction. Eden Parker is a thief. Brandon Ellis deserves to know what you stole. Pay $50,000 to the account below, or the truth goes public. You have 72 hours. Eden's hands shook so badly she dropped the letter. Blackmail. Someone knew who she was, where she was, and wanted money she didn't have to keep her secrets buried. Her first instinct was to run, pack the twins in the minivan and disappear again, change names again, rebuild again. Her second instinct was to call Brandon. He arrived within 20 minutes, reading the letter with the cold precision of someone who dealt with corporate extortion before. This is amateur, he said dismissively. Probably someone local who recognized you from old news coverage. The demand is too low for professionals. $50,000 isn't low, Eden protested, panic rising in her voice. It is when you're blackmailing someone connected to the Ellis family, Brandon countered. If they knew what they were doing, they'd be asking for millions. This is someone testing the waters, seeing if you'll pay easy money to avoid confrontation. I can't pay anything, Eden said. I have maybe 2,000 in savings. If they go public, if people find out who I really am, then they find out, Brandon interrupted, taking her hands. Eden, you didn't steal anything. You left a wedding, which isn't a crime. You had children and raised them, which isn't illegal. The only person who should face consequences is my father for forging legal documents. But Eden was shaking her head. You don't understand. If this gets out, the media will come. They'll camp outside the cottage, photograph the twins, and turn our lives into a spectacle. Noah and Lily don't deserve that. They deserve a mother who stops running, Brandon said gently but firmly. We face this together. No more hiding, no more fear. You're not alone anymore. Eden wanted to argue, wanted to grab her children and flee like she'd done 5 years ago. But looking at Brandon, at the determination in his eyes, at the promise that, this time, she wouldn't face threats alone, she made a different choice. Okay, she whispered. Together, they contacted local law enforcement immediately. Detective Martinez, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, took the threat seriously, enough to monitor Eden's cottage and trace the letter's origin. Brandon hired additional security, discreet professionals who blended into the beach town scenery while ensuring the twins' safety. We'll find them, Detective Martinez assured Eden during an interview at the police station. Blackmailers are usually either very smart or very desperate. The desperate ones make mistakes. This one had made several. The bank account listed for payment was traceable. The letter had been printed at a local FedEx office with security cameras. The typing style matched documents from a struggling freelance photographer who'd covered society events in Rhode Island 5 years ago. James Reeves, Brandon said when Martinez showed them the name. He photographed our wedding. I remember him. Asked a lot of personal questions, wanted behind-the-scenes access to make his portfolio stand out. Reeves was brought in for questioning within 48 hours. He confessed immediately, crying about medical bills and a daughter who needed surgery he couldn't afford. He'd recognized Eden at the Tidewater Gallery 3 months ago and spent weeks debating whether to contact Brandon directly or try to profit from the information. I'm sorry, Reeves sobbed in the interrogation room, visible through the one-way glass where Eden and Brandon watched. I wasn't going to hurt anyone. I just needed the money. My daughter, she's only 7, and the insurance won't cover. Enough, Martinez said curtly. You committed extortion. Your reasons don't erase the crime. Brandon surprised everyone by requesting a private meeting with Reeves. Eden watched through the glass as he sat across from the photographer who'd tried to blackmail them, expecting anger or threats. Instead, Brandon pulled out his phone. What's your daughter's name? Brandon asked. Sarah, Reeves said, confused. Sarah Reeves. She has a heart condition that requires surgery. The bills are... I'll pay them, Brandon said simply. All of them. In exchange, you'll plead guilty to extortion charges, accept whatever sentence the court determines, and never contact my family again. Why would you do that? Reeves asked, tears streaming down his face. Because 5 years ago, my father destroyed my marriage by making someone desperate enough to run, Brandon replied. I won't become him by punishing your daughter for your mistakes. But make no mistake, if you ever threaten Eden or my children again, my generosity ends. Outside the interrogation room, Eden stared at Brandon like she was seeing him for the first time. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did, Brandon said. Someone needed to break the cycle of using money as a weapon. Might as well be us. The legal proceedings took 2 weeks. Reeves pleaded guilty, received probation and community service instead of jail, time, and had his daughter's medical bills paid in full by an anonymous donor. The story never made the news. Detective Martinez ensured the case was handled quietly, protecting the twins' privacy. When it was over, Eden and Brandon sat on her cottage porch while Noah and Lily slept inside. The ocean whispered against the shore, and for the first time since the gallery reunion, the future felt like possibility instead of threat. "Thank you," Eden said quietly, "for not letting me run again, for standing with me instead of rescuing me." "We're partners," Brandon replied. "That's what partners do." "Are we?" Eden asked. "Partners, I mean." "What are we, Brandon?" He considered the question carefully. "We're two people who loved each other once and never stopped, even when we should have. We're parents learning to coexist for our children. We're survivors of the same damage, trying to build something better from the ruins." He turned to face her. "And maybe, if we're both brave enough, we're two people falling in love again. Slower. This time, with our eyes open and our hearts prepared for the work it takes." Eden's hand found him in the darkness. "I'm terrified." "Me too," Brandon admitted. "But courage shared is stronger than fear faced alone. When danger fell silent, only truth remained, and truth was love." The beach looked different at sunset, painted in colors that Eden had tried to capture 1,000 times, but never quite managed. She walked barefoot through the sand, Brandon beside her, while Noah and Lily raced ahead, chasing ghost crabs that disappeared into holes before small hands could catch them. 3 months had passed since the gallery collision. 3 months of careful rebuilding and tentative trust, of family, dinners, and shared parenting that didn't require court orders because they'd both chosen cooperation over conflict. "Stop here," Brandon said, gesturing to a spot where the sand was still firm, not yet claimed by the incoming tide. Eden stopped, watching her children play in the fading light. They'd started calling Brandon Dad 2 weeks ago, casually, like it had always been his name. The first time Noah said it, asking if Dad wanted to see his drawing, Brandon had excused himself to the bathroom and cried for 10 minutes. Eden knew because she'd heard him through the door, and cried too. Her, back against the wall, mourning and celebrating in equal measure. "I have something for you," Brandon said, and the nervousness in his voice made her turn fully toward him. He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket, though not the same blue-grey as the one from 5 years ago. This one was weathered brown, clearly vintage, clearly carrying its own history. Eden's breath caught. "Before you panic," Brandon said quickly, "this isn't what you think. Or maybe it is. I don't know. I've been carrying this around for 2 weeks trying to figure out the right moment and realizing there's no such thing as perfect timing." He opened the box, revealing not the sapphire ring his grandmother had left him. That still sat in Eden's hiding place beneath her mattress, returned but not forgotten, but something simpler. A silver band etched with tiny waves that circled endlessly, each crest, flowing into the next trough, a pattern that had no beginning and no end. "I'm not asking you to marry me," Brandon continued, his voice steadier now. "Not yet, maybe not for years. We have too much to rebuild, too much trust to earn back on both sides. But I'm asking if you'll consider the possibility. Someday, when we're both sure that we're choosing each other, not out of guilt or nostalgia, or because of the children, but because we've built something new from the ruins of what we lost." Eden stared at the ring, then at Brandon, then at their children playing in the surf. "What is this, then?" "A promise," Brandon said, "that I'm not going anywhere. That 5 years apart taught me what matters, and it's not empires or family legacies or living up to names carved on buildings. It's this, you, them, us. Imperfect and complicated and absolutely worth fighting for. Imperfect love," Eden repeated, testing the words on her tongue. "The only kind that endures," Brandon replied. "Perfect love is what we pretended to have at that wedding, when we were performing, for 200 guests instead of being honest with each other. Imperfect love admits fear, survives mistakes, and chooses to stay even when running feels safer." Eden took the ring from the box, feeling its weight in her palm. The waves etched into the silver caught the sunset, throwing tiny shadows that moved like real water. "I never stopped loving you," she said quietly. "Even when I hated myself for leaving, even when I was Emily Porter raising." Babies alone and pretending you didn't exist. I never stopped. The ocean crashed against the shore, foam reaching for their feet before retreating. Brandon took her hand, the one not holding the ring, and squeezed gently. I know, he said. I felt it too, like part of me was always waiting for you to come home, even when I'd convinced myself you were gone forever. Eden slipped the ring onto her right hand, not the left where wedding bands. Lived, but a promise held in the present rather than some distant future. It fit perfectly, which seemed impossible but also inevitable, like everything, about their story that shouldn't have worked but somehow did. Mama! Dad! Lily called from down the beach. Come see what we found. They walked together toward their children, toward whatever treasure waited in the sand, probably a broken shell or an interesting piece of driftwood, discoveries only 5-year-olds could properly appreciate. But as they got closer, Eden saw that Noah and Lily had built something while they weren't. Watching, a sandcastle, crude but ambitious, with a moat already filled with seawater. It's our house, Noah announced proudly, gesturing to the elaborate structure. That tower is my room, and that one is Lily's, and the big one in the middle is for you and Dad. We all live together in this castle? Eden asked, her throat tight. Obviously, Lily said, with the casual certainty of someone who hadn't yet learned that families came in complicated configurations. That's what families do. They live together. Brandon knelt beside the castle, examining it with serious attention. This is excellent architecture, load-bearing sand walls, strategic moat placement. You two might have a future in engineering, or art, Eden added, seeing the decorative shells Lily had pressed into the towers, the patterns she'd carved with a stick. Or both, Brandon said, looking up at her with a smile that reached his eyes completely. The castle wouldn't survive the night. High tide would claim it within hours, returning it to the ocean that had provided its materials. But for now, it stood as evidence that broken things could be rebuilt, that endings could transform into beginnings if you had the courage to pick up the pieces and try again. If this journey moved you, subscribe to Mr. Steele Rich Stories, where every tale reminds us that even broken hearts can build beautiful lives. Keep sharing, and let's grow this family beyond 600, one story at a time. 6 weeks later, a small article appeared in the Chicago Tribune's business section. Tech CEO Brandon Ellis announces permanent relocation to South Carolina for family integration. The piece was brief, mentioning his company's transition to fully remote leadership and his commitment to prioritizing what matters most. Industry analysts debated what his departure from Chicago meant for the market. None of them guessed the truth, that he was learning to braid his daughter's hair, helping his son build increasingly complex structures, and falling in love with the same woman twice in one lifetime. Eden's cottage became their headquarters while they figured out what came next. It was too small for 4 people long-term, but for now, it worked. Brandon contributed to rent and groceries, helped with the twins' preschool fees, and gradually his belongings migrated into their space. His laptop on the kitchen table next to Eden's paint supplies, his running shoes by the door. Next to the twins' light-up sneakers, his presence becoming essential rather than intrusive. Mornings became controlled chaos in the best possible way. Noah insisted on wearing mismatched socks because patterns are boring, Dad. Lily required exactly 3/4 of a cup of orange juice, measured with scientific precision, not more, not less. Eden burned toast while trying to finish a painting commission at the kitchen table. Brandon attempted to conduct business calls while children used his legs as climbing equipment. This is insane, Eden said one morning, surveying the wreckage of breakfast. Spilled milk, scattered crayons, a Lego spaceship somehow embedded in Brandon's laptop bag. This is perfect, Brandon countered, kissing her temple while rescuing his computer from further Lego assault. They established routines that honored both of their worlds. Tuesdays and Thursdays, Brandon video-conferenced with his company while Eden took the twins to the beach for nature studies that were really just excuses to play in the sand. Mondays and Wednesdays, Eden painted in the small studio space they'd created by converting half the cottage's garage, while Brandon handled preschool pickup and afternoon snacks. Weekends belonged to all four of them. Farmers' market trips where the twins picked out vegetables they'd refused to eat, sandcastle competitions. That grew more elaborate each week. Movie nights where they let Noah and Lily choose films that made adults question their life choices. "We're building something," Eden said one night after the twins were asleep. She and Brandon sat on the porch, sharing wine that cost less than his usual standard, but tasted better because of the company. "We are," Brandon agreed. "Not what we tried to build before, something different, something that fits who we actually are, instead of who we thought we should be." The conversation about their future happened gradually, not in one dramatic moment, but across dozens of small discussions. Should they find a bigger place? Should Eden sell the cottage or keep it as a studio? Should they consider moving back to Chicago, where Brandon's company was headquartered? Or stay in Folly Beach, where the twins had roots and Eden had built a life? "I don't want to erase Emily Porter," Eden admitted one evening, while they washed dishes side by side. "She survived things Eden Parker couldn't have. She raised our children alone and made a life from nothing. Going back to being only Eden feels like betraying her." "Then don't," Brandon said simply. "Be both. Be whoever you need to be." "I fell in love with Eden Parker, but I'm falling in love with Emily Porter too. The survivor, the fighter, the woman who chose our children over everything else. Even over you," Eden whispered. "Especially over me," Brandon replied. "That's not a failure, Eden. That's being a mother. I'm just grateful I get a second chance to prove I can be worthy of that choice." They told the twins the full truth on a Sunday afternoon, 6 months after the gallery reunion. Noah and Lily sat on the couch between them, sensing something important was about to happen with the intuition children have for moments that will reshape their understanding of the world. "You know how you asked about your daddy?" Eden began, her voice shaking slightly. "Why couldn't he be with us?" "Because he lived far away," Noah recited, the explanation he'd accepted for 5 years. "Because it was complicated," Lily added, always needing more details than her brother. "Well," Brandon said, taking over when Eden's voice failed, "I'm your daddy. I've been here for a few months now, and we wanted to make sure you were comfortable with me before we explained everything." The twins processed this in silence. Noah looked between Brandon and Eden, his analytical mind working through implications. Lily's eyes filled with tears, though whether from joy or confusion wasn't immediately clear. "You're our daddy?" Noah asked finally. "Like, our real daddy who made us?" "Yes," Brandon confirmed. "Your mama and I loved each other very much, but some difficult things happened that kept us apart. It wasn't because I didn't want you. I didn't know you existed until I saw you at the art gallery. But now that I know, I want to be part of your lives forever, if that's okay with you." "Did you leave us?" Lily asked, her voice small and hurt. Eden pulled her daughter close. "He didn't leave you, sweetheart. I left him before he knew about you. That was my choice, my mistake. Your daddy has been looking for us, in his way, for 5 years. I'm the one who hid us." "Why?" Noah demanded, protective instinct flaring. "Why would you hide us from our dad?" The question hung heavy in the small living room. Eden had known it was coming, had prepared answers that were age-appropriate, and honest without burdening children with adult complications. "I was scared," she said simply. "Some people in your daddy's family weren't very kind to me, and I thought they'd be unkind to you too, so I ran away to keep you safe. But I was wrong about your daddy. He would have protected us. I should have trusted him more." "Are you going to leave again?" Lily asked, fear evident in every syllable. "No," Eden and Brandon said simultaneously. "We're family now," Brandon continued. "Families stick together, even when things get hard. Especially when things get hard. Your mama isn't going anywhere, and neither am I." Noah absorbed this, then asked the most important question. "Can we still call you Dad?" "I'd be honored if you did," Brandon said, his voice thick with emotion. "Okay, Dad," Noah said, the word now carrying weight and meaning it hadn't before. Then, with the resilience of children, "Can we have ice cream?" The celebration was small, just the 4 of them walking to the local ice cream shop, Noah, and Lily, each holding a parent's hand, looking like any other family enjoying a Sunday evening. But it felt monumental, this simple act of being together openly, honestly, without pretense or fear. True success is peace, not power. Eden had learned this lesson in a cottage too small for comfort, but exactly right for connection. She'd learned it in the space between who she'd been and who she was becoming, in the daily choice to stay instead of flee, to trust instead of assume the worst. She watched Brandon help Lily reach the ice cream flavors she wanted to sample, saw the easy affection between father and daughter, and marveled at how something so broken had reformed into something more beautiful than the original. Forgiveness is the wealth that never loses value. Brandon carried this truth in every interaction with Eden, in the choice to focus on their present rather than their painful past. He'd learned it watching her parents their children with patience and grace, seeing what generosity of spirit looked like when it wasn't transactional or conditional. He could have demanded custody, could have used his resources to punish her for the years she'd stolen. Instead, he chose partnership over punishment, understanding over anger, building forward instead of staying trapped in backward-looking rage. Sometimes love's greatest strength is patience measured in years. They both understood this now, in ways their younger selves couldn't have comprehended. The love that had brought them together at a corporate event, instant and intense, and ultimately unprepared for real life, had transformed into something slower, deeper, built on foundation stones of failure and forgiveness and hard-won wisdom. 8 months after the gallery reunion, Brandon proposed properly. Not with the grandmother's ring that carried too much Ellis family baggage, but with a simple band he'd designed himself. Platinum, etched with paint brushstrokes on one side, binary code on the other, art and science merged into one circle. They married on the same beach where he'd given her the promise ring, but this ceremony was nothing like the Newport production. The guest list numbered 12, Linda Parker and Eden's sister, Rachel, and her family, Brandon's former assistant who'd become a genuine friend, the gallery owner who'd witnessed their reunion, Carl from the sandbar, Dolores from the clinic, and Detective Martinez who'd helped them survive the blackmail attempt. Noah and Lily served as ring bearers again, but this time they understood what they were witnessing. Their parents, choosing each other, choosing their family, promising to build something lasting from the ruins of what had broken. "I promise to stay," Eden said during her vows, her voice steady and sure. "Not because running is wrong, but because staying with you is right. I promise to tell you when I'm scared, instead of assuming you won't understand. I promise to love you imperfectly, honestly, with full knowledge that we'll both fail sometimes, and that's okay, because we're committed to trying again." "I promise to listen," Brandon replied, holding both her hands in his. "Not just hear words, but understand the fear and hope underneath them. I promise to choose you and our children over every empire, every expectation, every version of success that doesn't include our family. I promise to love you exactly as you are, Eden and Emily, artist and survivor, the woman who taught me that feeling isn't failure, it's the foundation of everything that matters." The officiant pronounced them married for the second time, and this time when they kissed, it tasted like promises they'd actually keep. The reception was a backyard barbecue at the cottage, paper plates and plastic, cups and a cake Eden had made herself that leaned slightly but tasted perfect. No champagne fountains or string quartets, no performance for people who measured worth in stock portfolios and family pedigrees. Just love, loud and messy and real, celebrated by people who'd witnessed their journey and believed in their future. Speech. Someone called, and Brandon stood, pulling Eden up with him. 5 years ago, he began, his arm around Eden's waist, I thought I knew what love looked like. It looked like grand gestures and expensive rings and weddings that cost more than houses. I was wrong. Love looks like Eden painting at the kitchen table while our children use her as a jungle gym. It looks like goodnight kisses that smell like toothpaste and bedtime stories, read in funny voices. It looks like choosing each other every single day, even when, especially when, it's hard. He turned to face Eden fully. You ran from me once, and it broke my heart. But in running, you saved our children from a family that would have damaged them. You built a life that taught them love is action, not just words. You survived everything I failed to protect you from, and you did it alone. I can't give you back those 5 years, but I can promise you the next 50, and every single day I'll try to be worthy of the second chance you've given me. There wasn't a dry eye in the backyard, including Eden's. The twins approached as the celebration continued around them. Noah carrying something wrapped in newspaper, Lily hovering close. "We made you a wedding present," Noah announced, thrusting the package at Eden. Inside was a clay bowl, misshapen and imperfect, painted in colors that clashed beautifully. 4 handprints circled the exterior, too small, too large, overlapping and permanent. "It's our family," Lily explained unnecessarily. "See, all of us together. We made it at the pottery place with Miss Janet from the gallery. She said it's okay that it's not perfect, because real families aren't perfect either." "It's absolutely perfect," Eden said, crying openly now. "It's the most perfect, imperfect thing I've ever seen." That bowl would sit on their kitchen table for years, holding car keys and loose change, and the small treasures of daily life. It would survive 3 moves, 2 cross-country relocations, and 1 incident where Noah tried to use it as a helmet. It became a symbol of what they'd built, flawed and fragile and fierce in its refusal to break. As the sun set on their second wedding, their real wedding, the one that counted, Eden and Brandon stood on the beach watching their children play in the surf. Noah had convinced Lily to help him build another sandcastle, this one featuring a moat so elaborate it required engineering consultation from Dad. "Are you happy?" Brandon asked, the question carrying weight because happiness had been elusive for both of them for so long. Eden considered carefully. "I'm terrified and exhausted and constantly worried I'm failing at everything," she said. "But yes, I'm happy. Are you?" "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," Brandon replied. Finally, the castle Noah and Lily built that night survived longer than expected. High tide came and went, but the structure held, protected by some quirk of engineering or luck, or the sheer determination of children who'd decided this particular creation deserved to last. Brandon took it as a sign. Eden called it coincidence. The twins claimed it was magic. They were all correct. Some stories don't end. They just transform into new beginnings, carried forward by the people brave enough to believe that broken things can be more beautiful in their reconstruction than they ever were in their original form. True success is peace, not power. Forgiveness is the wealth that never loses value. And sometimes love's greatest strength is patience measured in years, the willingness to wait, to work, to choose each other again and again until choosing becomes as natural as breathing. This is the story of Eden and Brandon, of mistakes and second chances, of running and returning, of love that survived everything meant to destroy it. This is the story of a family built not from perfection, but from the courage to try again.